Once upon a time, a little girl with a red hood enters a forest. She is warned by her mother not to stray from the path and to head straight to grandmother's house with the bread and cheese that is prepared for her. But Little Red doesn't heed her mother's advice. Little Red is tricked by a wolf and strays from the path to pick wildflowers. So begins a very familiar tale of Little Red Riding Hood. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of this tale, many of which are considered folklore, and these folkloric elements have been categorized by Arne Thompson Uther into a classification system that is commonly referred to as the ATU index. And what this index tries to do, it tries to categorize all of the folk, and including some fairy tales, into specific plot motifs. So wherever there are similar plot motifs, as you can find throughout all of fairy tales, they try to classify all of these things together. However, some of these stories, including Little Red Riding Hood, have become literary institutions in their own right. The published version of Little Red Riding Hood first appeared in Charles Perrault's Contes des Fées in 1697. It is the first story in his 1697 manuscript and has a really cute illustration of a wolf eating a little girl. Sometimes that is where the story ends. Little Red gets eaten, and that's it. Sometimes the huntsman, hearing Red scream, bursts in, slices the wolf open, and rescues both Granny and Little Red. And sometimes, but only sometimes, Little Red and the wolf fall in love, or at least have some sort of lustful encounter. That is the tale that we are going to discuss today. Angela Carter published her Bloody Chamber in the 1970s, and in it contains a story called The Company of Wolves. There are moments where the prose is absolutely hauntingly beautiful, and then there are moments where Carter deviates a little bit from our traditional Little Red Riding Hood script. Mostly in that Red doesn't meet a wolf, or at least not a literal wolf on the path, as she does in the other stories that are popularized by Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. Red meets a dashing young hunter. And instead of being tricked to stray from the path, the wolf challenges her that he will make it to grandmother's house first. Red, intrigued by this gentleman, waits. Red allows the young man to go to the grandmother's house. Now, there's a lot more back and forth within The Company of Wolves, and I highly recommend it as a reading. It's worth the read. But there are a couple of moments where it's questionable whether or not Carter's version would fit into a classification system like the ATU index. For instance, Red doesn't get eaten. The grandmother does, but Red does not. Instead, there's almost like a marriage ceremony in which the wolf, who is a werewolf, not werewolf, man, not man, it's very confusing. They get married to a howling of wolves, the company of wolves, outside the cottage. And then in other instances, Carter creates this absolutely beautiful prologue to the story. There are several pages before we even get to the Little Red Riding Hood tale type itself. And I want to share just a little bit of some of Carter's prose, because I really do think that it is beautiful. She says, "You are always in danger in the forest, where no people are. Step between the portals of the great pines, where the shaggy branches tangle about you, trapping the unwary traveler, in nets as if the vegetation itself were in a plot with the wolves who live there, as though the wicked trees go fishing on behalf of their friends. Step between the gateposts of the forest with the greatest trepidation and infinite precautions, for if you stray from the path for 1 instant, the wolves will eat you. They are gray as famine. They are as unkind as plague." Carter is really good at evoking this just really desolate landscape. And in a And throughout the whole story, she creates this beautiful imagery. She uses adjectives like gray-eyed children. She also creates this otherworldly experience. And she does this by combining elements that are traditional to folk and fairy tales, in that it is once upon a time. It is part of our time, but also not part of our time. So it feels very medieval, it feels very European, and it feels very isolated in a lot of ways. But then she also has moments where the woman, or a woman, is straining macaroni in her kitchen. Or she has other instances where the men are chopping firewood, which is admittedly sort of something that is familiar with fairy tales, but the way it's portrayed is very modern. And I think that's another thing that Carter does really, really well, is she takes these traditional folkloric elements and then she combines them with sort of our modern understanding. However, sometimes she does this in a way that is really jarring and is sort of almost too on the nose, if that makes sense. She talks about the girl having her first menses and how that is represented in the color of her hood, right? She's saying like the whole point is to connect. Red is no longer young and innocent, which I think is something that travels throughout the story, as we'll see when we get to this kind of traditional Q&A. We all know that there is a series, right, where Little Red asks the wolf who is pretending to be Granny. In this instance, the wolf is not even pretending to be Granny. He is very much who he is. He is seen as either the dashing young man or the wolf. It kind of flips between the two. But in the Q&A, it's turned a little bit differently because the wolf asks Red questions and then she responds, but then she also responds with questions. And so they kind of go through this series. And so ultimately, she is standing naked before the wolf hunter man with the company of wolves howling outside. And it starts with, "What big arms you have, all the better to hug you with." Every wolf in the world now howled a prothalmion outside the window as she freely gave the kiss she owed him. "What big teeth you have." She saw how his jaw began to slaver, and the room was full of the clamor of the forest's Liebestod. But the wise child never flinched, even when he answered, "All the better to eat you with." The girl burst out laughing. She knew she was nobody's meat. She laughed at him full in the face. She ripped off his shirt for him and flung it into the fire, in the fiery wake of her own discarded clothing. The flames danced like dead souls on Walpurgisnacht, and the old bones under the bed set up a terrible clattering. But she did not pay them any heed. So this is one of those instances where Carter has taken something that is familiar to us, right? This Q&A that Red has with the wolf, and she changes it and kind of modernizes it. And in some ways it works, and in some ways I think it changes the story fundamentally, right? It no longer fits neatly into the Little Red Riding Hood tale type. And the other thing that she does that I think is actually really beautiful is this combination of singing and songs. So the wolves aren't just howling, they are singing an aria. Earlier we see that they are singing a dirge, part of a funeral song, but they're also singing the marriage song. And so it's sort of this tracking through of the death of innocence, but the birth of new life. And so Carter, I think, does that well. But I think that from a folklorist standpoint, her version of Little Red Riding Hood doesn't really fit into the ATU classification system. However, I think time will tell whether or not it will fit in with the literary institutions as established by Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. But only time will tell.